Tiktakers. Today, we compile the worst tortures on the channel. It makes our hair stand on end to think that these methods have been used with so many people in ancient times. In a good part of the world, this only appears in the history books, but unfortunately, other forms of torture are still used in many more countries than we think.
Water is a very valuable commodity. Throughout history, it has been used in many key moments. Water decides battles, determines the wealth of a people, and generates life. But it's also been used to cause death. As we're sure you already know, throughout history, multiple forms of torture have been used. Fortunately, this has been left behind, and nowadays it is punishable in most countries. Today we want to talk about the water drop torture, or Chinese drop. This is a physical torture, but also psychological. It consisted of completely immobilizing the prisoner who was lying face up. Just above his head, there was a mechanism that caused a drop to fall on his forehead every 5 seconds. After a few hours, the physical damage to his skin was more than evident. You could see a blister of sorts that increased in size as time went on. But the physical was not the worst part. The prisoner was in a completely isolated room. The only sound he heard was the sound of water falling on his forehead. That was the only activity on which he concentrated his attention. This, after a few hours, generated an important state of mental alienation. Moreover, Tiktakers, bear in mind that the prisoner was completely immobilized, and although he had water falling on his forehead, he could not drink or move a millimeter to get it. In the end, between dehydration and nerves, the prisoner ended up dying. This was usually due to cardiac arrest caused by the complicated mental state to which the torture led him. This method of suffering seems to have occurred to Hippolytus de Marcellus, an Italian lawyer and physician who lived in the 15th century. Seeing the erosive effect that water had on stones, he thought of trying it on people. Therefore, the technique is not really Chinese despite its name. It is believed that it was so called to give it more mystery and drama. Its use lasted for many years, even reaching American prisons in the 19th century. Over time, some variations were also added to the technique. Some used ice water instead of room temperature water, so the effect was faster and more effective. Others blindfolded the victim and exposed him to an audience that laughed at his misfortune. This increased the mental stress and increased the psychological damage. And you know, Tiktakers, mental damage is often much worse than physical damage. Fortunately, these methods have been forgotten, and remembering them should help us to continue fighting to guarantee the human rights of all people.
Welcome to a new video of historical torture. Today, we will explain to you what a Scaphism torture is. According to Greek writings, this method of torture was practiced during the Persian Empire in 401 before Christ, and was undoubtedly one of the cruelest procedures in antiquity. This torment consisted of putting the victim in a wooden box, sometimes even in a small boat, with 5 holes, through which his extremities protruded: head, hands, and feet. He was fed spoiled food to cause diarrhea. And since he couldn't escape from the box, he carried his droppings inside, attracting insects that fed on the feces and putrefaction. In addition, the executioners smeared the limbs with milk and honey to attract more bugs. These, captivated by the smell of feces, entered his anus and left eggs inside him. The eggs hatched quickly and the larvae began to feed from the inside of the torturer to the outside, so the person became food for bugs. The torturers sought to prolong the victim's death. They didn't want him to die of malnutrition or dehydration. In addition, they were interested in the condemned person continuing to defecate inside, to increase the level of putrefaction inside the box, so they forced him to continue eating spoiled food. If the victim refused, they poked him in the eyes to put pressure on him and get him to swallow. After eating, they poured the mixture of milk and honey on his face and put him in the sun. In this way, countless mosquitoes, flies, and other bugs arrived. As the individual's body was immobilized, he could do nothing more than watch how over time he was being devoured and infected. When the man died, they removed the upper part of the box and saw that part of his body had been eaten, and that he had swarms of insects feeding in his entrails. According to some writings, the suffering could last up to 17 days. In case this torture still doesn't seem too cruel to you, there is a variant of the Scaphism. In this case, instead of putting the victim in a box, they put him in the belly of a dead horse or other large animals. First, they killed the animal, removed part of its organs, and put the condemned person inside. Then they sewed the skin, leaving the person's head, hands, and feet on the outside, just like with the box. In this way, a double putrefaction was produced. The bugs began to eat the skin of the animal inside and out, while the victim was also slowly eaten away. As you can see, TikTakers, sometimes history tells us facts that can produce more chills than a horror story. Welcome to a new video of torture in history, TikTakers. Today, we bring you the break-and-wheel torture, also known as the wheel torture. The wheel was a method of torture used in Europe in the Middle Ages and modern times. The last recorded execution was in 1841 in Prussia. To carry it out, first the victim was firmly tied to a bench or cross, and then the executioner proceeded to break all the bones and joints of the condemned with an iron bar or other similar instrument. The impact had to be strong, but without killing the victim. They didn't want death to be quick. They wanted the condemned person to suffer slowly with each blow they dealt him. For this reason, they avoided hitting the head, leaving it intact, and focused on breaking or dislocating limbs. After this, the victim was placed on a cartwheel so that the ankles touched the head. To do this, the legs had to be dislocated upwards, and they placed their arms around the circumference. Afterwards, the wheel was hooked to an axle that was nailed to the ground, leaving it elevated and in a horizontal position, and the victim on it. When they had everything ready, they made the wheel turn, breaking his bones and causing his death. When they were looking to lengthen their finish, they let the ravens finish their job, allowing the birds with their pegs to rip strips of meat from his body and empty his eyes, until producing one of the most atrocious and agonizing deaths one can imagine. In the other versions, the victim was stretched face up on the ground with the limbs extended to the maximum and tied to iron rings. Pieces of wood were placed across the wrists, elbows, knees, and hips. Then the executioner, with the wheel, crushed bone after bone and joint after joint, trying not to kill the victim. According to the documented testimony of a German, the condemned man became a kind of howling puppet, writhing like an octopus between rivulets of blood, raw, viscous, and amorphous meat mixed with the splinters of broken bones. Then the procedure was the same as we have detailed. They put their body between the spokes of the large horizontal wheel and raised it. As normally, his ribs were also broken. His breathing was very weak. So apart from the pain he felt, the victim suffered a slow and agonizing death without being able to breathe properly. Many times, the sentence could dictate the time that should elapse between the execution and the final blow, lengthening or shortening it depending on the seriousness of the crime. Sometimes the end was produced by ripping off the head of the victim and placing his body on the wheel and the head nailed on top of everything, so people could see how justice was ruthless with criminals. This torture was used in cases of serious crimes such as treason or murder. At that time, when someone committed any of these crimes, they were automatically disowned by society. So this method of torture satisfied the desire for revenge of the people, who would sleep more peacefully knowing that this person would pay for their crimes. According to ancient writings, Saint Catherine, also known as Catherine of Alexandria, was a Christian martyr sentenced to this torture in the 4th century. The ruling emperor at the time ordered her execution on a bladed wheel. But when Catherine's body touched the wood, the wheel broke. Some say that it was the angels who tore it to pieces. Unfortunately, this didn't prevent the emperor from ordering her head cut off. This was one of the most popular shows that took place in various places in Europe. Hundreds of illustrations made in our past show large groups of commoners and nobles delighting in the display of this cruel torture.
Hey there, TikTakers. We recently published a video with the bloodiest torture in history, and you've written to us asking us to explain more. So, we've decided to tell you more details about one of the most terrible, saw torture. In this torture, a person was hung by the feet, head down, and two torturers sawed the body in half. The steel teeth of the saw easily cut through the victim's trunk, causing great pain. As a result of the inverted position of the condemned, it was ensured that sufficient oxygenation reached the brain, and general blood loss was prevented. According to stories from the 19th century, the victim didn't lose consciousness until the saw reached the navel, or even the chest. In this way, he stayed alive for a long time, feeling the pain caused by the saw cutting his body in half. This method was bloody and very cruel. It was often applied to homosexuals, although among gays and lesbians, it was used more on men. For this reason, the torture began with the genitals, because they were considered the fruit of sin. It was also used with women accused of witchcraft and who were blamed for being pregnant by Satan. In the case of these women, torture wasn't used to make them confess, but to end their lives and the supposedly demon-possessed fetus. In the Bible, David, the Hebrew king and Christian saint, exterminated the inhabitants of Rabbah and all the other Ammonite cities by the method of putting men, women, and children under saws, rakes, and iron axes in brick ovens. The fact that this method appeared in the Holy Scriptures contributed to the acceptance of the tortures of the saw, the axe, and the stake among Christian men. Believe it or not, it was a means of military execution in countries like Spain. For example, in Catalonia, during the War of Independence, the Catalan guerrillas subjected dozens of enemy officers with this torture. In Germany, it was used with the leaders of the rebellious peasants, and in France with the witches pregnant with Satan. Not so long ago, the convicted were victims of this type of torture, when in many cases they were innocent. Fortunately, justice has advanced, and in the majority of countries, prison is usually the punishment for those who don't comply with the law.
Welcome to another video of historical torture. Today, we bring you the disembowelment. In this torture, the victim was made a longitudinal cut and then a transverse cut in the belly. With these cuts, all the internal organs of the abdomen were exposed. The torturers proceeded to extract the organs of the victim one by one, except the vital organs. In this way, the person suffered and was kept alive. At the same time that his organs were being extracted, they were shown to the wounded man, managing to cause him a horrible terror in addition to all the pain that was produced. The torturers didn't want the victim to pass out or die prematurely, so they gave him special herbal concoctions to drink that kept him awake. Unfortunately, this type of torture was widely used in various parts of the world. In Europe, there are reports of its practice in Romania, Holland, the Roman Empire, or England, among others. In the latter, the punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered was used for men convicted of high treason. Hugh Despenser the Younger is an example of a victim of this torture. He tried to starve himself before his trial, but was unsuccessful. He was sentenced to death, where he was first dragged through the streets naked. As if it were a show for the watching public, biblical verses were written on his body against the deadly sins of which he was accused. Later, they put him on the gallows, but released him before suffocation killed him. Immediately afterwards, he was firmly tied to a ladder. His genitals were cut off and burned in front of him while he was still conscious. Then they opened his abdomen, disemboweled him, removing his organs one by one in an established order so that he would stay alive as long as possible, seeing as his entrails were ripped out and thrown into the fire. Later, his body was cut into 4 pieces and his head was hung on the gates of London as a warning to others. In Japan, disembowelment played an important role not only as torture but also as a way of killing samurai. It was said that by taking their lives in this way, they were considered free from the disgrace of their crimes. The most common form was what is known in Japanese as seppuku, which means stomach cutting, which implied 2 cuts in the abdomen followed by the extraction of the viscera themselves. We continue to be horrified at these cruel methods. Did you know this torture, Tiktakers? The death by 1,000 cuts, also known as lynching torture, was a form of Chinese torture used until the beginning of the 20th century to carry out the execution of death sentences. This torture consisted of stripping the victim naked and tying him to a post. Once attached, a multitude of cuts were made, which could range from several hundreds to 3,000. The first cuts were superficial, avoiding damaging veins or arteries. They wanted each wound to cause a lot of pain without bleeding that would cause death sooner than desired. They sought a slow and agonizing death. After these incisions, the victim was dismembered. If he was favored by the compassion or bribery of a relative, he would be previously drugged with opium. The pieces of the body were deposited in front of him: nose, ears, arms, hands, chest. He was kept alive while the condemned could see his pieces accumulate in front of him, until ending with the cutting of his head or the extraction of a vital organ. The horror of that practice, in which the skin was sliced until the bone was exposed, was observed by the rest of the town in a public square. It was also used to show what could happen to those who broke the law and went against the rules. Then, to end the procedure, all the parts of the dead were placed in a wicker basket and exposed to all those present. In this way, this torture functioned as a sentence on 3 levels: as a form of public humiliation, as a slow and prolonged death, and as punishment after death. Since its inclusion in the penal code in the Yuan dynasty until its abolition in 1905, this method of torture was used against those accused of 3 types of crimes: family crimes, those considered inhuman by Chinese morality, and lèse-majesté, that is, the one that attempted against the emperor or supposed a rebellion and offense against the Chinese imperial system. This form of execution was officially abolished in April 1905. Photography was invented before it was abolished, and therefore there are photographic records of this type of public execution. An example was the case of Fu Zuli, a guard who assassinated his boss, a Mongolian prince, in February 1905, and for which he was sentenced to public dismemberment in Beijing in April of that same year. His death occurred 2 weeks before prohibiting this type of torture, being for many the last to be carried out publicly. The scene was contemplated by a large number of people. Some Europeans took photographs that ended up being published as a series of 12 postcards that were sold in Europe. The photographs of this convict, along with that of other victims, became the subject of many articles and books published around the world. Death by 1,000 cuts, or lingchi, is just one of the many methods of torture and murder carried out in China in not so distant times. Hey there, Tiktakers! On other occasions, we have told you about some torture method used in ancient times. And the truth is that these videos give us a lot of grief, but it is good to remember them so that none of this happens again. Today, we're going to tell you about the most horrible torture methods in history. We warn you, this video is not suitable for sensitive bodies. Let's start by talking about the knee separator, a torture that used a contraption with spikes up and down. The knees were placed in the middle. Those peaks were getting closer and closer until they finally cut the knees and left the victim without legs. Sometimes the spikes were heated to produce more pain. And to continue with spikes, now we go to the bamboo. In case you don't know, this plant grows 90 centimeters a day. For this reason, our ancestors thought that if they placed a person on top and left them for a long time, the bamboo would end up going through their body. Ultimately, this resulted in death, either because the spikes pierced an organ or because of the enormous loss of blood. Another element that was used a lot was fire. With it, they invented 1,000 ways to make others suffer. But without a doubt, the one that seems most terrible to us is the Roman candle. It was invented by Nero and consisted of tying the victims to a wooden pole and covering them with flammable fire. Then it was set on fire, just like a candle. Similar was the bull in fathoms, a torture that consisted of introducing a person into a metal bull. They placed him on top of a bonfire, for which the tortured died of severe burns or suffocation. As you already know, many of the tortures tore parts of the body. Among them is the cutting. The victim was strangled without actually dying. Then his genitals were gutted and cut off and burned at the stake. Finally, his head was cut off. Another similar one was cat's nails. It was named for the contraption that was used, sharp metal nails that were used to tear meat from bones. The pain was very intense and the injuries, well, you can imagine. But no less than when torture was based on skinning the victim while alive. How it hurts to have her skin lifted next to a nail? We cannot imagine how much it hurts to be taken out in pieces. The next torture we want to talk about is the saw. They hung a person by the feet, head down, and 2 torturers sawed the body in half. And sometimes it wasn't enough to cut a person in half. They looked for ways to increase the suffering. For example, with the blood eagle. This torture consisted of cutting an eagle on the back or carving the ribs to take them out and take the shape of this bird. As you know, water has been used throughout history in multiple tortures. Among them is the cellar, which consisted of tying the victim with a rope from the top of the mast of a ship. Thus, they would jump the victim into the water several times until he ended up dying. Another one that used water was scalding. People were immersed in boiling water, oil, or wax. They started at the feet and worked their way down. There are thousands and thousands of examples, Tiktakers, such as the mechanism that stretched the limbs so much that it ended up cutting them. But it is clear that they are all outrageous. These methods could never be used to find justice or revenge. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. And if you want to see more Draw My Life videos, subscribe to our channel. See you in the next episode!